Zulfi Bhutto of Pakistan. His Life and Times by Stanley Wolpert. Chapter 6. Foreign Minister to the Field Marshal, 1963 to 1965. Zulfi went to New York again as head of Pakistan's UN delegation in late 1962 and was then engaged in a 6-month series of talks on Kashmir with Sardar Swaran Singh, leader of India's UN delegation. India's Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru also went to New York for the UN session in late 1962, staying at the Hotel Carlyle on the Fifth Avenue, just a few blocks from where Zulfi always stayed, the Prier. Nehru invited young Bhutto to his suite for tea. They had first met in Bombay a quarter century earlier, when Zulfi was just a boy and the British still ruled over India. Pakistan was as yet unborn. We were standing on the top floor in the drawing room of his suite by the window, Zulfi recalled. He had his leg on the railing. He was looking down at the traffic and talking about the past. He said, "Look how small we are," as he pointed to the people and the traffic below. I nodded. He then said this world has to be saved from destruction, from atomic weapons. That was Nehru's last visit to New York. He died just a year and a half later. His immediate successor would be Lal Bahadur Shastri, who would be followed to the pinnacle of South Asian power, soon afterward by Nehru's politically astute daughter, Indira. In many ways, Zulfi admired and sought to emulate Nehru, whose foreign policy of non-alignment and friendship with China had drawn heavy criticism from Washington, yet paid handsome dividends in winning India's support not only from the Soviet Union and China, but throughout the Third World. Zulfi's foreign policy was thus inspired in part by Nehru. Jawaharlal's Trinity Cambridge training and Fabian socialist philosophy were an education more radical than Zulfi's, but both were heirs to substantial fortunes and paternal political wisdom. Motilal Nehru, 1866 to 1931, had presided over India's National Congress in 1919 before he managed his son's successful candidacy for that high office shortly before his own death. As chief architect of independent India's foreign policy, Jawaharlal had eschewed all Western pressures to join in Dulce's practices, yet won support for Indian development from every major industrial power of the world, including the United States. Nehru's global vision and foresight gave India almost undisputed leadership of the underdeveloped Third World of Asia and Africa, as well as East Europeans like Yugoslavia. China's foreign minister, Chow En-lai, would challenge Nehru and India's primacy in that important uncommitted portion of the world, of course, as would Zulfi Bhutto later. Despite Bhutto's admiration for and emulation of Nehru's neutrality, Kashmir proved too explosive an issue for India or Pakistan to diffuse short of war. Zulfi's first major achievement as foreign minister was to conclude a Sino-Pakistan boundary agreement on 2nd March 1963 that became the cornerstone of Pakistan's strongest, most important Asian alliance. The long-standing Sino-Indian cold conflict over the border turned into a hot war in November 1962, when Chinese forces poured over India's northern border and wiped out Indian troops, heading virtually unopposed towards Assam's capital of Guwahati. China's recently discovered road, built across the Aksai Chin in Ladakh, had triggered earlier border clashes with Indian police in that remote region. But by the end of 1962, it seemed as if Asia's two gigantic powers were headed for all-out war. President Kennedy, responding to the urgent call from his New Delhi ambassador, John Kenneth Galbraith, to whom Prime Minister Nehru had appealed for help in desperation, immediately ordered the airlift of enough US military equipment to arm and outfit 10 new northern tier divisions of Indian troops. As the first US military jumbo jets landed in West Bengal, China's forces swiftly opted for unilateral withdrawal, leaving Indian territory as suddenly and unexpectedly as they had invaded. Pakistan's conclusion of a boundary agreement with China in the wake of that Sino Indian War, ceding the Aksai Chin region that it did not actually control at this time to its powerful northern neighbor, was viewed with anger and alarm by India. New Delhi charged Pakistan with having unlawfully ceded more than 2,000 square miles of Indian territory to China, vehemently protesting in the UN Security Council that the government of Pakistan had unlawfully altered and unlawfully apportioned Indian Union territory to China in violation of UN resolutions of 17th January 1948 and 13th August 1949. Foreign Minister Bhutto countered India's charges on 25th March 1963, calling them part of a systematic and sustained campaign of propaganda against Pakistan. He insisted that Pakistan has not ceded even 1 square inch of territory to China, but has gained 750 square miles, which had till then been in China's occupation and control. Bhutto used the opportunity of refuting India's charges to reiterate Pakistan's claims to all of Jammu and Kashmir, and it demanded that a plebiscite to help out the military divided state. The charge of aggression against Pakistan has been repeated ad nauseam by India over the last 15 years. Jammu and Kashmir was not, Zulfi argued, a pan, integral, or otherwise of India, but belonged to the people of Jammu and Kashmir, the future of whose territory must be decided with an impartial plebiscite under the auspices of the United Nations. It was outrageous of India to claim sovereignty over it. He saw no substance, moreover, to India's charges that Pakistan had violated the Security Council resolution of January 17, 1948, in reaching a border agreement with China. To the contrary, by agreeing to delimit and demarcate its boundary with China, Pakistan had helped to improve the region's prospects for peace. Foreign Minister Bhutto then listed no fewer than 11 violations of the same UN resolution that had been committed by India in Kashmir since 1948. Pakistan was ready to conclude a truce agreement with India, here and now, so that both Pakistani forces and the bulk of the Indian army might be withdrawn in a synchronized manner. The withdrawal would enable a plebiscite under UN auspices. That July, Bhutto spoke again on Kashmir in Lahore, responding to what he called vile and slanderous attacks against Pakistan by Prime Minister Nehru. Kashmir is to Pakistan what Berlin is to the West, Zulfi argued, echoing President Kennedy's cry at the Berlin Wall. Without a fair and proper settlement of this issue, the people of Pakistan will not consider the crusade for Pakistan complete. The continued conflict in Kashmir threatens the peace and security of the world and was an issue hanging heavily on the conscience of mankind. Pakistanis would not forsake a righteous cause merely because more bayonets and bullets may be supplied to India from any source to consolidate her usurpation of Kashmir. How could deception and fraud replace truth and virtue? Zulfi's rhetoric in Lahore boiled close to the point of ignition. He had engaged in prolonged, fruitless negotiations with Swaran Singh for half a year, so long that he had learned to mimic each of his Sikh adversaries' traits and foibles, entertaining his ministry officials, as Salman Taseer reports, how he scratched his ear when he was thinking, his nose when he needed time, or rubbed his forehead when being evasive. Zulfi was almost as good at mimicry as he was at debate. Jawaharlal Nehru, then, in the last year of his life, would not budge on Kashmir, fearing, he said, a Hindu backlash within India should a plebiscite be held. Nehru was unwilling to risk losing the lovely valley over which he continued to wax poetic, calling it his ancestral home, though the Nehrus had migrated from Kashmir to Delhi and Allahabad several centuries earlier. He also compared Kashmir to a beautiful woman, and like Zulfi, Nehru had a weakness for women. A few days after his Kashmir speech in Lahore, Zulfi drove to Karachi where he suffered such acute stomach pains at 3 a.m. shortly after going to bed that his doctor rushed him at once to the hospital for an emergency gallbladder operation. Zulfi had suffered periodic bouts of malaria, compounded since childhood with influenza, but this episode was his most acute illness to date. His usually robust body remained so weak 10 days later that when he spoke to conclude the National Assembly's foreign policy debate, he requested the chair's indulgence to remain seated. Unfortunately, India is the spoiled child of the world. Foreign Minister Bhutto, who well understood that syndrome, began. India gets away with all its machinations by irrational explanations which the world only too readily swallows. The misfortune of this region is that the powers which are not familiar with India's mentality and do not understand India's approach to international problems are only too eager to accept Indian policies at their face value. That makes it possible for India to continue to menace the peace of the region and the world. Up till then, India had committed aggression no fewer than 5 times in Kashmir, Junagadh, Hyderabad, Goa, and China. In contrast to Pakistan's good relations with neighbors like Nepal, Ceylon, Sri Lanka, Indonesia, Burma, and Afghanistan. India's regional posture was one of arrogance and intransigence. Yet India asserted it was a peace loving state. Zulfi defended the wisdom of his ministry's negotiations with India on Kashmir and of his Kashmir policy against opposition criticism. To those who said that by entering into the talks with India, we compromise the Kashmiris' right to the self-determination, Zulfi declared that in every round of his talks with Swaran Singh, the right of self-determination of the people of Kashmir constituted our basic stand for a settlement. He went on to argue, on the other hand, that India was a loser in the negotiations because during the past 15 years, its position had always been that the problem of Kashmir had been settled and finished. By the mere act of reopening negotiations, therefore, real political Bhutto insisted, India admitted the existence of the Kashmir dispute, which it had come to settle on an equitable and honorable basis. He took credit for having made the Kashmir problem a live problem again. India has acknowledged that fact, Bhutto was proud to report. He assured his listeners that India cannot keep Kashmir under subjugation much longer because this state of affairs is bound to result in an explosion. In November 1962, Ambassador Galbraith had wisely suggested to President John Kennedy making reopened negotiations on the Kashmir plebiscite a prerequisite to the immense airlift of US military aid to India. But Kennedy opted to send arms as swiftly as possible, abandoning any potential leverage Washington had to bring Nehru back to a plebiscite table. Nehru did, however, offer Pakistan a no-war pact, but Zulfi rejected that as sinister. A no-war pact with India can have the effect only of lulling us into a false sense of security and making us feel that India would not resort to force against us. Then we could become easy victims of Indian aggression. Foreign Minister Bhutto thus restored Pakistan's policy on Kashmir to its pre-Liaquat Ali Khan phase, proclaiming total mistrust of Indian promises as well as intentions in this area, vowing never to give up on Kashmir problem no matter how long the struggle. This problem, I declare, must be settled and it will be settled because no one can deny justice for all time to the people of Kashmir. Future history will show that the people of Kashmir will not forever be denied their inalienable right of self-determination. At the same time, he appealed to the West to Pakistan's allies to remember that India has repeatedly said that Pakistan is India's enemy number one. It is India that has committed aggression. Before leaving the National Assembly, Zulfi bolsters the sagging spirits of his countrymen by informing them, we have our friends. We have assurances also from other countries that if India commits aggression against us, they will regard it as aggression against them. We shall never be alone in facing aggression. Here he was referring to Chinese promises he said he had received in Beijing during his recent visit there to sign the boundary agreement. He may also have had whispered words of reassurance from some of his closer friends in the Trucal Sheikdoms, possibly from North Africa and from his good friend President Sukarno of Indonesia. On his first visit to Washington as foreign minister, Zulfi met with President Kennedy in the White House in October 1963, a month before President's assassination. We talked of the Sino-Indian conflict, the decision to give India military assistance. Bhutto recalled the consequences of an Indian armed to the teeth for her neighbors and the future prospects of US-China relations. Zulfi urged the bold and imaginative president to recognize China, but Kennedy said that only if the American people will endure me for a second term would he possibly venture to break new ground in that part of US policy. Bhutto liked Kennedy, and the feeling seems to have been reciprocated. For he recalled that as the president shook his hand before leaving, he remarked, if you were an American, you would be in my cabinet. Zulfi sharply retorted, be careful, Mr. President. If I were American, I would be in your place. At which they both laughed heartily. In New York, Zulfi attended the UN General Assembly session and enjoyed a number of elegant parties, private as well as diplomatic. He always found the high life associated with UN meetings stimulating, enjoying beautiful women, good food, and high spirits of every sort. One of the women he met at a cocktail party that fall was Rita Dar, daughter of Madame Vijay Lakshmi Pandit, 1900 to 1990, the first woman president of the General Assembly. Mrs. Dar recalled how immediately after meeting her, Zulfi eyed her lasciviously, inviting her to come up to his apartment, that sort of thing. To her irate refusal, Zulfi replied, any woman in Karachi would be honored to be asked. Mrs. Dar responded that she was not from Karachi but from Delhi, at which point he turned abruptly and stiffly walked away. By late November 1963, Foreign Minister Bhutto was back in Karachi. In an address to the prestigious Lions Club there on the United Nations and world peace, he called for an early end to the underground atomic testing and the spread of nuclear weapons. He advocated superpower disarmament and urged cutbacks in conventional and nuclear forces by East and West. However, world peace was perhaps least secure in Asia. This vast and ancient continent, inhabited by more than half the population of our planet, continues to be the scene of great convulsions which may well change the destiny of mankind. He noted that though Pakistan had friendly relations with China, Iran, and Burma, recently concluding agreements with each, border disputes with India remained volatile, most of all in Kashmir. He hailed a recent Pan-African meeting in Ethiopia and called for Asians to adopt greater continental consciousness. Sukarno of Indonesia, one of Zulfi's role models, was planning to host a Pan-Asian conference in Jakarta. Indonesia's Bandung Conference of 1954 had spelled out 10 principles of international conduct. Among them was elimination of all forms of colonialism from Asia and Africa, and the famous 5 principles of peaceful coexistence that Nehru had so warmly endorsed. The time has come, Bhutto urged, to convene a second Asian-African conference to review the conclusions reached by the first and to revitalize and renew its pledges, which still remain unfulfilled. A few months later, Sukarno announced that the second Indonesian Afro-Asian Conference would be held in April of 1964, but it was never convened. In December 1963, a scarred hair of the Prophet Muhammad kept in the Hazrat Bal shrine near Srinagar turned up missing, apparently stolen, triggering riots that swept across Kashmir and left death and fear in their wake. India flew in fresh troops and tightened its grip over Kashmir, whose special status under Article 370 of the Indian Constitution had been somewhat eroded by making Articles 356 and 357 applicable to Kashmir in October 1963. In January 1964, Foreign Minister Bhutto requested an urgent meeting of the Security Council to consider the grave situation in Kashmir, a situation he attributed to India's unlawful steps in arrogant disregard of the resolutions of Security Council. He viewed recent Indian actions as part of a sinister design over the past 15 years to obliterate the special status of the state of Jammu and Kashmir by refusing to honor its own earlier commitment to the holding of a free and impartial plebiscite under UN auspices. En route to New York, Zulfi stopped in London where he met with Foreign Minister Alec Douglas, Home and Commonwealth Secretary of State Duncan Sandys to muster British support for his Security Council appeal. Interviewed by the BBC and asked in the light of Kashmir's having been discussed in the UN Security Council no fewer than 109 times over the past 15 years, that would be the 110th discussion likely to bring the problem any nearer to the solution? Bhutto replied, "We are prepared to discuss it for 1,000 times to see that the problem of Kashmir is settled in an honorable manner." Pressed for proposals he would present the UN, he reaffirmed his faith that a plebiscite is the solution. The basic factor involved is the right of self-determination for the people of Kashmir. As violence escalated in Kashmir, the Security Council, to avoid further Soviet veto, appealed to India and Pakistan to settle their differences in Kashmir by direct negotiations. India then announced that Nehru was ready to talk with Sheikh Mohammed Abdullah, the state's most popular political leader and a former chief minister who had been dismissed from that office in 1953 and held in detention for more than 11 years. With a 3-month interval of freedom in 1958 for having publicly proclaimed in June 1953. What is now wanted is that people of the state to be given an opportunity to decide their future freely and without fear. Sheikh Abdullah, hailed as the Lion of Kashmir, held a press conference early in April at which he cautioned that the only alternative to a negotiated settlement for Kashmir was a clash of the arms between India and Pakistan, which would be suicidal. The Sheikh opposed permanent partition of Kashmir and fearlessly declared from crowded platforms throughout the valley, "They think of rearresting me, but if Abdullah is rearrested, will the Kashmir issue be settled?" The People's Republic of China had not as yet been admitted to the UN. Still, Chow and Lee flew to Pakistan at this time to underscore China's support for Pakistan's position on Kashmir. The problem should be settled in accordance with the wishes of the people. Nehru's health was fast fading and he hoped to avoid further conflict with China as well as Pakistan. Hence, he ordered Abdullah's release, wishing he could use that most popular Kashmiri to negotiate a peaceful settlement of this persistent South Asian problem. Zulfi Bhutto flew to Indonesia early in April to meet in Jakarta with Sukarno and Foreign Minister Subandrio, as well as with Chow and Lee. Zulfi was ready to sign an anti-imperialist resolution on Vietnam at that agenda summit for the still scheduled Second Afro-Asian Conference, but Ayub restrained him, fearing that such an announcement would jeopardize US aid to Pakistan. Zulfi managed nonetheless to get his friend Sukarno to endorse a statement on Kashmir similar to the one Chow had made in Pindi. From Indonesia, Bhutto flew to Washington for a Cento ministerial meeting in late April. There, he addressed the National Press Club. Most of what Bhutto said in Washington focused on the Kashmir dispute, the bane of all troubles and problems, not only between India and Pakistan, but in that whole region, even beyond the subcontinent. The people of Kashmir were in revolt, unmistakably in revolt. The problem can be settled, will be settled, has to be settled. Only then would Pakistan be able to live in peace with our great neighbor, India. He also touched on the need to end poverty and squalor throughout Africa and Asia, and on Pakistan's opposition to apartheid because we believe in the equality of all men. Adding that with India's rigid caste system, its anti apartheid statements made him think aloud. Physician, heal thyself. It was an effective brief speech. Soon after returning home, Zulfi flew from Pindi to New Delhi with Sheikh Abdullah to attend Nehru's funeral just after his death on 27th May 1964. They had sufficient time in that hour's flight to discuss a fallback position on Jammu and Kashmir. The Sheikh advised Zulfi to hold tenaciously to the plebiscite demand for the entire state, but suggested that Jammu and Kashmir's partition below the river Chenab at a point called Petlinot would be a realistic final position. Bhutto was elated by the Sheikh's flexibility. In earlier talks at Pindi with Ayub, Abdullah had firmly insisted that any partition was unacceptable. A few days later, Zulfi met with Kashmir's other major political leader, Mirza Afzal Beg, who basically agreed with Abdullah's position. Beg, however, urged that Pakistan not abandon some 40,000 Muslims living in Doda district at that time, and Bhutto promised to keep them in mind. Bhutto placed a wreath on Nehru's bier on behalf of Ayub Khan and then spoke with Nehru's mourning daughter Indira Gandhi in Teen Murti House, where Nehru's aorta had burst. The USSR's premier Alexei Kosygin and Sri Lanka's Prime Minister Mrs. Bandaranaike were also present, as was Sir Alec Home and a host of Indian dignitaries. Bhutto joined the funeral procession despite Delhi's sizzling heat on that Thursday, the 28th of May.